Welcome to Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet, a special InnovationAus.com video podcast series brought to you by Ping Identity. From debating access to anonymity issues in online culture wars to fighting cyber threats on the commercial internet or in the delivery of government services, identity impacts everyone. In this series, we will speak to a compelling list of experts to trace the global online trends that have helped frame digital identity and to understand the cyber landscape shifts that have shaped identity access management practices and zero-trust environments. Join us as we explore the philosophical and practical sides of identity, the fundamental issue at the heart of the Internet.
Hello, welcome to Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet, a podcast series Innovation Oz is producing in partnership with Ping Identity. Today I'm talking to Ash Diffey, Vice President of Sales, Asia Pacific and Japan at Ping Identity, and Eddie Smith, General Manager, Identity and Security at Versent. Our topic today is no transformation without identity and achieving digital transformation success. Look, I don't know who coined the term digital transformation and where it came from, but it seems to be all we've talked about for a very long time. Maybe it's even started to lose some of its actual meaning. I wanted to start this, if I could, with you, Eddie. When we talk about transformation, digital transformation, what does it mean to you, and how has the identity component wrapped itself into projects, and how's that kind of changed over time?
Yeah, digital transformation means many, many things to many, many people, and we used to joke very early on that digital was dead as a concept, which is very awkward if you have digital in your title when I'm talking to you. But ultimately, it could be customer facing, it could be workforce facing, it could be partner facing, and it really is just the move from a more analog style of process, be that manual, be that paper based, to a digital or online, mobile, voice, whatever those different channels are, but really just transforming that process and take advantage of modern technologies to do things faster, more efficiently for organizations. How identities impacted that, it becomes very, very apparent when you're doing any sort of digital transformation that things need to talk to things, and ultimately identity is what enables that communication layer, be that from end user to server, or be that server to server, or mobile app to server, or any of those interactions. Identity really is that sort of enabling wrapper that enables those communications to happen securely.
So I guess, this is the thing. We talk a lot about digital identity these days, in the last couple of years in particular. And Eddie, I'll stay with you just for a moment. What is it that changed in time that we're talking fundamentally about digital identity as the platform layer for the entire process, whereas there's digital transformation projects have been underway for a very long time, as we know.
Yeah, so I guess the other challenge is, well, digital transformation is a very broad term. So is digital identity, and it can be everything from verifying my identity as part of a sign-up process so that I can get my credit card, or it can be the authentication layer, or it can be provisioning and a governance layer for me into downstream systems. So identity transformation itself, or digital identity, is also a very, very broad topic. But I guess what's really sort of brought it to the forefront is as people start to stop going into physical locations, we need a way to both validate my identity and assert my identity through what transaction I'm performing, and then have that layer its way down the different stacks as different things talk to each other. So if I've got a mobile app, it needs to assert my identity to the app server. If the app server then talks to a partner site, that flow of identity and that end-to-end flow of identity is what's really become important to people, because it reduces risk process or exposure if I can operate in what I call a me context instead of a you context, which is a little more traditional.
So Ash Diffey, Ping Identity has obviously been around for a long time, has been having this conversation for a long time. What's changed in the last several years in terms of that conversation, or have you just been banging the same drum the whole time on these digital identity and digital transformation issues?
We certainly haven't been banging the same drum. I think there's been a pretty rapid evolution over the last 5 or 10 years around what digital identity is and what people are using it for. If we look at local markets, so things that we've seen in Australia and New Zealand market, the biggest proponent we've seen for digital identity is really around finance and the regulatory compliance that's been pushed on the banks or implemented for the industry, I should say. And there's some interesting things that hit the media recently where there was a customer tried to withdraw cash because they'd forgotten their ATM card. And that's a really good example of a use case where physical meets digital, and had that digital experience been better put together, that customer would have been able to walk into the branch and say, I'm this person, here's my digital identity, and interact with an ATM the same way. So perhaps they may not have needed to have that physical interaction in the bank had the ATM been able to link their digital identity to that cash withdrawal process. So there's a really simple use case there of digital to physical, and that's where everything has evolved to. Whereas I think definitely 10 years ago, but even 5 years ago, we weren't yet at the point that digital identity was so key to every interaction we have in our daily lives.
So, and it is fundamentally central to my daily life, and I'm sure it is to yours as well, in a whole bunch of different areas. But in terms of adoption, across, the economy-wide sectors and large companies, small companies, public sector, private sector, all of that, where do you think we're up to now? Like, I mean, we're kind of deep into it, but there's a long way to go, isn't there, until it becomes that sort of frictionless identity management that you talked about with the ATM example.
I think Australia's in a really interesting place. We've had a few different frameworks and national level programs that have taken off in the last 5 or 10 years to really deliver on a digital identity. Where we are now, I think there's some really interesting things happening, and Australia is right at the forefront globally of being able to deliver some amazing frameworks to allow interoperability of different kinds of digital identities for all. So what we will end up with is something where Australian citizens are going to have the benefit of choice and using verified credentials in meaningful ways that is within their control. And that within their control piece is probably the big differentiator from us and a lot of other nations, I think.
Eddie Smith, I wonder, do you want to speak to that? I'm sort of interested in whether people will, by choice, maintain several or many digital identities for different parts of their lives, or whether you will make a choice and you will have one digital identity. What are some of the privacy issues at play there, or just simply the individual control issues?
I think individuals inherently don't like their worlds to collide in some cases. So we've put in login with social credentials a large number of times for organizations, and invariably the take-up in some industries is significantly lower than the take-up in others. And for example, I don't think any of the banks have said, we're going to let you log into your internet banking with Facebook, for example. So people don't like these sort of worlds to collide, and they compartmentalize their lives. So health, tax/finance information, banking information, social media, telephony, whatever those different spheres are that people decide to divide, will continue to probably like to compartmentalize. But and I guess there's going to be an education process that's going to for people to understand that things like verifiable credentials allow you to keep those sort of stovepipes of information, but over time, just because of the nature of distributed identity. But also, when I'm authenticating, it's how do we ensure that I'm passing the right information, only what the organization needs, and that the organization that information is being passed to has the right lineage and retention processes on top of that. I think that's where we'll start to see a change is in organizations at the back end, is as they start to go, do I really need to collect it and keep it? I need to know it at some point. Sometimes I'm legislatively obliged to keep the information, especially have a law enforcement requirement, e.g. the telcos. So it's. I think there will be a gradual evolution. I think, we've got pockets of brilliance in Australia, but lack of interoperability in a lot of areas, right? So it is still very stovepipe. While New South Wales is charging down the verifiable credentials path, their digital driver's license isn't MDL spec'd, so they're not up with the -5 ISO standard. That's coming on their roadmap, but they went VCs first. We've got Melbourne, who followed New South Wales in a lot of similar way, or Victoria, who followed New South Wales in a few similar ways, and they're now pushing down the ISO path. Queensland went the ISO path. I think once the states all bobble up to that ISO level, then we'll see a lot more interoperability, which will then allow the growth of the solutions, and we'll start to see more interesting use cases. But ultimately, much like consumer data right, the success of digital identity in Australia is going to be on how do I use it, not who gives it to me.
I can see you nodding vigorously through that answer, Ash. If you want to,
very long-winded answer.
If you want to jump in there and maybe give us a view from Ping.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. And I mean, this is the world that Eddie and I live in. We deal with a lot of conversations regularly around how is one organisation or one agency or a state doing things versus another, and how do we get to that level that we've got interoperability in a common denominator or a common platform that everyone can work with. The digital driver's license is such a great example where we've seen New South Wales deliver on something many years ago, which was absolutely ahead of its time when they launched. It has delivered a really great experience to citizens of New South Wales, whereas other states like Victoria are still quite a ways from that level of interoperability or integrating all of their services in the same fashion. And then, of course, we've got our federal government and, across all states, how do we get everyone working together and developing a platform or platforms that are delivering similar or same experiences at the same time and all maturing at the same rate, I suppose is probably the best way to look at it. And there's no simple answer to that because you've got obviously different budgets, different people in control power, and then it gets into politics, which obviously impacts things pretty significantly sometimes as well.
Can you just step me through? I mean, we're many hundreds of millions of dollars into a federal government program on this federated digital ID model. So I'm just talk me through where that program looks like it will finish up, and does it require that the states, as Eddie was saying, bubble up to a kind of a certain level, area of level functionality and credentialing, and then the federal system then trying to understand whether there is a federal oversight here that's necessary, or whether the standards based across the other jurisdictions and perhaps even larger corporate IDs is enough?
That is a great question, James, and I suspect it's been asked a few times in Canberra. We would say I think inherently Australians don't like being told, and I don't think federal government mandating a digital identity is going to be the answer here. I think we need to see a clear framework that gives us trust and the benefit of convenience. So give citizens a reason to draw down on something and use a platform is the key to the success of it. Where I think that happens, and certainly this is in line with what Ping Identity have been doing globally, and where we're investing our time and effort in developing our products and taking to market a roadmap that we think is going to service our customers and their customers and citizens long term, is providing platforms that can interoperate between each other by way of consent and authorization. So really getting down to, if James chooses to use James's identity, digital identity that is from Canberra where he resides, and wants to use that to integrate with national health systems or national government agencies, or even to cross over into another state to access a government service while there temporarily, James needs to have the control and the convenience to be able to say, I authorise my digital identity to be used in this way from this period of time to this period of time and no further. So that user journey of being a known, trusted, verified identity and having those controls to turn it off and on conveniently and easily is where I think we need to go. So does it need to be mandated? No. Do government agencies need to build meaningful platforms that can talk to each other? Yes.
Yeah, it's quite perhaps it's not for this discussion, but philosophically it's quite, it's a foundational element of government that it has a database of its known citizens. So this model that you've just described is quite a different thing. So I can see why a federal government might kind of look at that and try and understand, well, what identity, like, do we control passports, for example? There are different things that they would need to control.
Fundamentally, the states have been responsible for what I call origination of identity. Each state, with its birth, deaths, and marriages department, effectively originates identities for the company at the very lowest sort of level. The only other source of identity documentation or source of identity in the country is DFAT at that point, Foreign Affairs and Trade, with immigration cards and certificates. And when you think about it, those 8 areas are the sources of identity in Australia. Everything is then built on that in an ever-growing fashion, be that the little blue book my kids get when they went to school with vaccinations. Then I get my first bank account, then I get my Ls, then I get my Ps, then I get my tax file number, and then I get a passport because I need to go overseas. Everything grows, but everything comes back to that, either that births, deaths, or marriages, or my immigration certificate as that fundamental source of identity for Australian residents/citizens. So in that, the federal government represents a very, very small percentage of origination of identity. But where they can give us something, is, as Ash said, is defining how do those other 7 locations talk to each other, and how do we establish that trust between them. And they've done a good job with TDIF in terms of bubbling that up, in terms of defining that. There were a couple of hiccups along the way with the double blind and introducing a 2.5 and a 3.5. Just to sort of make things a little bit more confusing, but it's gradually getting towards that sort of level where it's usable. And I guess the main challenge is probably, how do I integrate with it? Because the actual onboarding process is now quite difficult and full of friction. To become an identity provider or a consumer, you have to have quite a high level of trust. And this is where I think commercial equivalents of TDIFs, like Connect ID, or more globally like Gain, where they have a lower onboarding requirement because they pass less data, we'll see the expansion of that. So they'll start to interoperate, and we'll end up with what we happily call a trust fabric or a trust network, as opposed to a single point. And I think fundamentally with distributed identity, you can't have a single point that rules everything, but it does come down to how you then layer and build those layers of trust.
So let's talk about cybersecurity for a minute, or security by design, or in these digital transformation projects. I guess this is for you, or for you, Ash, but Eddie, jump in if you like. I guess the cybersecurity landscape has changed dramatically, as has digital identity. Given the evolution of both, given the fairly high-profile breaches, the active discussions around the amount of data that companies should be holding at any one time, personal data should be holding at any one time. So where are we now, and when will we be finished?
I don't think it's ever going to be finished, James. But it's a great question. I think where are we now? I think Australia is in a great place as far as we now are looking more earnestly at the problem. Even 12 months ago, I don't think Australia was really standing up and saying what needs to be done, or what is a reasonable expectation of organisations, whether it's private, public, Australian or international interests that are holding data. I think some of the high-profile breaches we've seen have really exposed some of the things that were probably left just to everyone expected they were being done, and they weren't, it seems. As far as where are we up to with security, I think everything we're talking about today around identity and all these, what needs to happen to make a meaningful digital identity happen, that all has to be built on trust. And if you suffer a breach, or if data is leaked or lost, or it falls into the wrong hands, that trust evaporates. It's one of my favourite sayings, that trust is earned in drips and lost in buckets. So if you suffer a breach because you don't have the right security controls in place, you can largely say goodbye to the good work that's gone into it, often for years, to get to the point that you're at. I think that's legislatively, I think we're in a good place at the moment in Australia. I think there are some significant implications if people get it wrong, and I think that's a good thing for the citizens of Australia. How the enterprise, private and public sector respond to that now and build for it is the big challenge, especially when we're facing some economic hardships.
So the digital identity piece of this, though, tell me if I'm wrong, but the digital identity piece should mean that companies hold less personal information about you at any given time. Have I got that right? Yep.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Well, yes, they should hold less, and it puts the controls in the hands of the owner of that identity credential to say what should or shouldn't be shared for how long.
Okay, so Eddie, in the projects that you've managed, the transformation projects, but with a digital identity component, when you've gone into places to conduct an initial audit, like what are you finding in terms of the amount of personal information that are held in a traditional IT shop?
It varies from the ridiculous to the sublime. Is probably the best way of putting it. We've come across people who've, as part of the onboarding process for employees, they've kept copies of driver's licenses and passports or utility bills or council rates just forever, and they've never had the concept of what do I need to delete, when do I need it to delete it. So if someone's worked for you for 6 months 30 years ago, they've still got copies of those documents from 30 years ago. So it's not a great place to be, because they'll be sitting on some sort of file share in an organization, or preferably in some sort of secure document management system, which it also does vary. And then as what we're finding is, as people are migrating from their old traditional storage up to the cloud, what we can now do is use tools like Amazon's Macy or Purview from Microsoft to actually do analysis and go, why are you keeping all this information? We can start to identify it. Previously, a lot of these organizations just haven't known what they've got stored and where. They know they've got the HR bucket sitting over here. They know they've got the eKYC bucket or the KYC bucket for customers sitting over here maybe. But, in a lot of cases, for example, the banks that I think about 10 years ago, they did an audit of the actual photocopiers they use to copy the documents, and they found that they're all still sitting there in memory.
Wow.
Just a mere memory dump away in a couple of the branches, because that some of those things are, different model meant that the process for clearing the memory wasn't able to be followed because it wasn't quite that easy, or it just didn't work the way it was hoped. So it really does vary. But what we're now seeing is, because we can move these things into places like Amazon and places like Azure, we've actually got tools where we can scan automatically and go, look, that's a credit card, or that's a date of birth, or a passport number, or a tax file number, etc. And it shouldn't be there. And it then lets the organisations take stock of what they've got and go, right, this is what I need to fix. This is how I need to fix it.
Right, and by fix it, you mean literally delete it? It's
not necessarily delete. This is part of the problem we have. Is so PCI as a standard, payment card industry standard, is got some excellent controls, and it's really well defined how you manage credit cards, how you manage CCVs, how you manage all that information. What we don't have is equivalent guidelines for PCI. So we've got the, ASD do some great stuff with the Essential 8 and the Essential 8 maturity model. It'd be great if we could come up with a personal identity, a fantastic 5 or a terrific 3 or something like that for PII, which is tokenize, encrypt, lineage, classify. I'm trying to get to 5. But it's that style of thing where we actually tell people what to do with the data rather than saying that was naughty. It's like give people guidelines and solutions, as opposed to just a stick to say, well, you shouldn't have kept that. Right. So if we look at some of the breaches, some of them had to keep the data because it's a legal requirement. Because, as I said, telcos have law enforcement requirements around interception and things like that. They can't get rid of the data, right? But could they protect it better? Probably. And it's just like, let's help them with defining how they could do that. As opposed to just saying that was bad.
Okay, I'm talking to Ash Diffey, the Vice President of Sales Asia Pacific and Japan at Ping Identity, and Eddie Smith, General Manager at Versent. Ash Diffey, just as we start to wind up, I'm interested to know who's doing the most interesting work in your area in terms of adoption and application of ID. Like, what sort of market sectors are doing interesting stuff? Obviously finance and telcos and governments have long been into this stuff. But what are the sort of emerging sectors that are really embracing this.
Yeah, thanks. I'll give you a two-part answer to that. I often get asked who's doing security right, and I'm very quick to say the big four banks in Australia, they get it right. They have got very robust frameworks. They are governed by some pretty meaningful legislation and compliance requirements, but they absolutely are one step ahead all the time. And even when there are issues, they respond super quickly. And I think that is the gold standard that we have in our line of sight. Who's doing really interesting things? I think there are some really interesting things happening in the digital retail space. So some of the major digital retailers across Australia and the Asia Pacific region are doing some really interesting things right now. And some of the airlines are doing some great things. So really focusing on that user experience and making it easy for people to interact, because that's ultimately what's going to drive consumption in a digital world. What is easy for me to do, I will latch onto. For me personally, I think PayPal is another great example of something that has just taken over the world because it existed as an intermediary, but I trust PayPal as the thing for me to make any interaction online. For a purchase or subscriptions, I put it all in one place. I trust it. I've got an app. If anything ever interacts with it that is anomalous, I get a notification and I can stop it. That is, simplicity and security perfectly balanced for me.
Okay, Eddie, I'm going to ask you that same question. Who's doing some interesting stuff? I'm also sort of interested in where SMEs sit in all of this. Do smaller companies kind of have access to the same tech, but they've got access to the same kind of ability to apply it?
That's two questions. So in terms of, I think probably the most interesting identity initiative going on at the moment is actually Australian Payments Plus and the launch of Connect ID. I think that's sort of going to wrap around TDIF. It's going to integrate with TDIF, but it's going to give the commercial sector a very lightweight way of leveraging digital identities. And it'll be interesting to see the use cases that come up and the use cases we use it for, be that cashless wagering in New South Wales or online alcohol delivery in New South Wales when that legislation starts to kick in. But it's just things like that where it's driving it, but also as Ash has sort of alluded to a couple of times, consent. I think consent is fast becoming a new battlefield or a new differentiator for some organisations. Apple have sort of placed their flag on privacy as a key feature. And I think so those style of things, I think, is where it'll be interesting over the course of time, but it's also where we're seeing a lot of movement, and then how verifiable credentials comes into that in terms of distributed identity and sort of erodes at that online ecosystem, as it were, with the distributed ecosystem. But I think that one's probably a few years away because we still haven't got the online version right. So it's how that gradual swell moves. But I think Connect ID is probably the most interesting project at the moment, both from a data holder or an identity holder perspective and an identity recipient perspective. Second question was how do SMEs play into it? Do you mean SMEs like me or SMEs like smaller organisations or software organisations?
The Australian economy is sort of, in sheer volume, is kind of dominated by smaller companies. So in terms of digital identity being applied across the economy, they need to be on board. I'm just wondering, where smaller companies are.
Look, and this is part of the problem with things like the Consumer Data Right and TDIF is the onboarding components for a smaller business. It's difficult to get the relevant security certifications, audits, etc. done. There's a large overhead to participate in the scheme. Connect ID has lessened that and simplified it. And I think, as they do that more or limit the data based on your certification, for example, I think that'll happen. But it's in a lot of cases for small businesses, what does a verified identity give them? If they're an online alcohol retailer, huge amount, right? If they're a small super fund looking to sign up people or an insurance company, quite a lot. But if they're an online retailer, it doesn't actually give me a lot if I'm just selling t-shirts. Right. So it really will depend on the use case, and does it buy down risk for them, or does it give a better user experience, or what are those different differentiators that a digital identity is going to give them? in those flows to remove friction and lower their risk ultimately.
All right, I'm gonna finish on a question that I hope it may well just open an entirely new conversation that might keep us here for a while, but it's hard to talk about anything. Well, there's a couple of things actually. You can't talk about anything in our sector without talking about skills on the one hand, but also asking about how AI will, apply in this area. So when we talk about digital ID and the trusted frameworks that you've described and the digital transformations that you've also described, with the evolution of artificial intelligence right now across everything, how what sort of impact is it going to have in the work that you guys do? Ash.
Okay. I was wondering if you wanted to go with Eddie, all right? So AI is a very big question, James. AI and some of the things we're seeing coming from a threat landscape is something we need to be building for in prevention and preparing for. How do we really verify or authenticate someone when we're dealing with them in a digital capacity? So this again increases the importance of verified credentials and making sure that we are authenticating James with something more than James on camera. So AI has reached a point where you could be very much a synthesized James, not real James today. And we've got no way of knowing other than if we had a digital verified credential coming with you. That's the difference there. For us as an organisation and delivering on identity projects as there are more and more of them happening. They are getting bigger and bigger. We've invested really heavily in a product that has been in market for about 2 years now. It's called Ping Da Vinci or Ping One Da Vinci. It was recently a finalist in an ARN Innovation Award. So it's really doing some great things. And it's a low-code orchestration engine where you can design the flows and drag and drop how you want a user experience to look without needing a team of developers to go and do all that heavy lifting. So it's really accelerating the ability to build and connect experiences for customers, for our customers, to build for their customers, getting them time to value, time to market, and better experiences just faster.
So that's an application of AI in building out a digital ID framework across the business. Well, Eddie, let me ask you then. What about on the threat side of that? Is there anything specifically you can see on the horizon in relation to AI and digital ID that's either going to need a change of tact or more thinking?
Yeah, I was looking at something last week, and I've decided to remove my voicemail greeting because apparently the new engines only need 8 seconds of your voice to be able to synthesize it accurately, which means if you're using voice biometrics, it's kind of not as valuable as it was about 2 years ago. So I think things like that will be problematic where we have historic, my voice is my password, verify me style of interactions. Those will become less useful, or the threats surrounding those will become problematic. I think also where we use behavioral analytics, if the AI knows or the bad guys knows we use behavioral analytics, it doesn't take much to ask an AI to make it match the other AI's behavioral analytics. So we'll get into that battle of who AI is more human. I personally think I would fail a Turing test, so the AI is already doing better than me. But I think those sorts of things will be interesting from a threat landscape, but I think it's also got great benefits for us. So, a lot of the analysis work we have to do to onboard new applications into identity ecosystems will be able to feed that into learning models, language models, and have them feedback how we would ease or streamline the onboarding for those applications. So we can remove a lot of the administrative friction from a lot of the use cases, which will then onboard more applications to the ecosystem, then which inherently then makes it more secure as long as those threats I mentioned don't get too advanced. But look, it's AI is interesting. The language models are interesting, and it's really how can we use them to be more efficient and optimize ourselves and optimize some of these things that are normally difficult and trawl through hundreds of pages of documentations or standards to determine compliance. But yeah, it would be naive to think that the bad guys haven't already started working out how they're going to use them to bypass the controls that we've spent months training.
All right, we've been talking to Ash Diffey, Vice President Sales Asia Pacific and Japan for Ping Identity, and Eddie Smith, General Manager Identity and Security at Versent. That was a very interesting conversation. Thank you both very much for joining us. We could have kept going for some time. That was Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet, brought to you by Innovation Oz and Ping Identity. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, gents.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Identity Matters, Digital Identity and the Evolution of the Internet video podcast series, brought to you by Ping Identity. For more, keep tuning in to innovationoz.com/podcasts or visit pingidentity.com.